What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another modern video. And while normally on Mondays I like to post obviously a different deck in the format, either maybe it's gotten some new cards, just to the metagame, or just a deck that I really haven't explored. But with the Pro Tour coming up this coming weekend, I wanted to kind of go over that and kind of make this week about the modern format. And we're going to kick it off with some of my expectations for Pro Tour Lord of the Rings, which will be this coming weekend. Believe it's the 28th, 29th, and the 30th, where we'll see players play, 2 days worth of Magic of the modern format and the limited format, and then of course a top eight being on a Sunday, like it traditionally is. So, what are some of my expectations? I'm going to kind of go through just like the list, kind of like some overarching things, and maybe a little bit more in depth kind of as we go. But of course, before I get into that, if you are not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos like this, or you're interested in modern content or pioneer content, please consider subscribing and ringing a notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. Of course, you just get my stuff in your subscription box as well, subscribing to my channel. And the links in the description of this video, I have two of them. One goes to the Discord server, the other one goes to my Twitch channel. Go ahead, join the Discord server and follow me on Twitch so you know when I go live. So overall, for the modern Pro Tour, the very first one that we've had in a while, the thing that I'm expecting kind of the most is the Lord of the Rings cards to really kind of like show off in the format. And of course, in like the weeks that we've had the Lord of the Rings set, the One Ring has went from a card that I think people kind of downplayed the significance of to proving that like this is a card that like you need to answer a lot of the time, or at least stop kind of the engine from going, because players are going to be able to abuse it very effectively. It's going to bury a lot of people if you get too far behind with it, and you need to find a way to stop it. On top of that, like Bowmaster being one of the ways to actually punish players like playing the ring, but at the same time, like the decks that are playing the ring kind of have a decent way of like answering a Bowmaster kind of like once it's in play, so requiring you to have multiple copies of Bowmaster, which is pretty easy or hard depending on if you have the One Ring or not. Also, just like being generally good in those sort of things, since we kind of see less and less of the decks that like to just play cantrips. I believe that even though Murktide is one of the still, I believe, one of the more popular decks in the format. I think it's like the second or third most played deck. It's kind of a deck that like spins its tires. It plays like considers and stuff like that. Like the thing that has going for it is that some of its like draw spells and like card advantage and stuff isn't necessarily drawing a card like with expressive iteration and things like that. But they do have Mishra's Bauble. They do have considers and things like that. So, and they have Ledger Shredders too, which all trigger Bowmasters, which could eventually just make big tokens and a bigger threat and everything, and of course just end up dealing damage and chip damage to the point where you have to answer the token or you have to answer the Bowmaster and so on. I get into that in my Bowmasters video, and of course I also have a video about the One Ring as well, if either of those videos interest any of you watching. We also are bound to see Delighted Halfling. Delighted Halfling being in the like four-color Omnath decks and a lot of like the Yawgmoth. You see it in certain lists and things like that. It's a card that obviously isn't making as big of an impact as the One Ring or Orcish Bowmaster, but nonetheless still a card that is kind of worth keeping an eye out for and picking up if you have not already gotten it. It's a great mana fixer. It still produces mana even without, it produces colorless mana, but it's still pretty good, even in like those decks that aren't necessarily like playing the legendary spells. If you are playing, a considerable amount of them, it can still help cast your spells. On top of that, like being able to give it uncounterable in certain matchups is really nice, especially when decks are playing Spell Pierce or playing Mystical Dispute. If you're like in the Cascade decks, you have Force and Negation, things like that. It definitely helps, like especially like with resolving like planeswalkers in that vein. Also allows decks to play a little bit more like convoluted mana base, but also able to like fetch up basic lands, kind of like what we had seen from like the Oko days where we had Astrolabe, where you were able to like play basic lands but still produce like a wide variety colors of mana. So this card kind of doing it a little bit more vulnerable to the interaction of the format, but nonetheless still very good for what it does. There's also a few other like commons and stuff that are showing up as like pieces in very specific decks. We have the cyclers for the Cascade Living End deck, and then of course in I believe in Rhinos, it's like Lauren's something or other. Honestly, it's like a card that just kind of started seeing play, and I have not been familiar with it. But we have cards like that definitely making an impact in the format, which also, interestingly enough, the fact that this was a set that was like straight to modern, legacy, whatever. Usually with like the Modern Horizons 2, we would see decks that were kind of like built around the release of the set. With the Modern Horizons, we had Hogak, which eventually turned to Hogak Summer. Modern Horizons 2, I mean, we've had, you know, uh, I believe a reprint of Red and Six in that set. You had the fetch lands getting reprinted. You had Ragavan. You had the pitch elementals, which themselves have created their own archetype and then also boosted other archetypes into the format as well. And with Lord of the Rings, we haven't really seen it. I mean, we obviously like some of the cards take center stage in it, but it doesn't really, create like their own deck. However, they have seriously juiced up some of the top players in like the modern metagame as well. So definitely look to see like the Lord of the Rings cards kind of like steal the show. Hopefully, their home pro tour, if you will, just from the fact that like they've proven to be very powerful, and players are gonna have to come up with the answers for them. And honestly, for some of them, there's no like real good answers. And in the worst case scenario, it goes unchecked, and your opponent either just drowns you in card advantage, is able to kind of leverage the blowout capacity of Orcish Bowmaster, or just get to cast like a bunch of other things ahead of curve and so on. So that's probably like my almost guaranteed lock of the Pro Tour is that these Lord of the Ring cards, especially the three I specifically went out of my way to mention, are planning on stealing the show. Like from the trends that we've seen in the modern metagame and like in challenges and stuff like that, while there are decks that maybe aren't necessarily playing these cards that are top aiding and so on, there's a reason why like a lot of these cards and a lot of these decks are putting up numbers because they are very powerful and they are also very good as well. That being said, usually in the Pro Tour with a like a smaller like metagame and a more niche metagame, because you have a lot of players that are just like kind of like going for broke, if you will, where they're picking decks that either answer the decks that you would expect, so playing something like Tron when you're like playing against Hammer, or if you're playing expect to play against like One Ring decks and so on, things like that. There's been times where decks have kind of come out of nowhere and eventually became archetypes. Famously, one being like Death Shadow, where it started as like this Death Shadow Zoo deck, and then it kind of morphed into Grixis Shadow. And of course, we've had a million and one iterations of just about every possible combination of Shadow decks thereafter, and then ended up being like one of the best decks for a while. While I don't necessarily expect that to happen here, there has been crazier things that have happened at Pro Tours. So while I would be surprised if it happened, I'm not totally sold that it's impossible. That said, definitely expect some kind of off meta picks. Cards or decks like Tron, Burn, and Mill specifically, just because they have the tools in the main deck already to kind of fight against like the One Ring and Bowmasters and things like that. Some of the cards that you would expect to be very good at this Pro Tour that people are going to try and play. Of course, there's like the other like higher tier decks that you could place like in the top echelons of the modern format, like in Yawgmoth and in the black red scam decks and things like that. Ultimately, I expect kind of the good players, players that may have only played in like a few pro tours, to kind of take this route of playing a deck that is pretty good to very good, and kind of tweaking it towards some of the more specific matchups for like a metagame that they expect, which of course I think is what every player is going to do going into this. That's just kind of the smart thing to do to ensure that you have the best matchup possible, and kind of hope that you get those matchups that you're hoping to get in kind of tweaking your deck in that way. I also kind of expect some people to pick up these decks to kind of throw people off. Maybe they're not like necessarily prepared for them in that way. And I think Burn is one in particular that is very consistent, is always very good in the format. Well, I shouldn't say very good, but like it's just always like some decks can win faster than it. And some decks want to play a very longer game and can just absolutely drown you in advantage. But Burn is always this constant, like even on 1 or 2 lands, like they can find a way to kill you by like turn 3 or turn 4, and just kind of like put you in this bind. And I think a lot of players like that just expect to kind of piggyback off the ring that aren't able to like get an early Omnath going or kind of like translate those cards that you draw from the One Ring into pressure on the Burn deck to end up winning the game before it can win the game. Burn can just kind of steal games and matches that way going forward. Tron, as I had mentioned, has a Karn that can just blow it up in Karn Liberated, and another one in Karn the Great Creator that could just stop it from activating entirely and go get your own ring as well. Obviously, then like putting you in the card advantage seat and drowning out your opponent because you're very much likely to draw haymakers in like the top 4 cards, or at least like some way to continue cycling through your deck to eventually find like an Ulamog or something like that, which could also get rid of copies of like the One Ring, and then eventually just kind of like put your opponent in this position where like they're too far gone and are just unable to play the game of Magic. Mill, I think, attacks the ring decks in a different angle, where Burn, your opponent does take damage on their upkeep from the ring and everything, and but they can just like reset it. If you're not able to like get them to a relatively low life total, they're going to be able to take it up to like 3 cards, and so they'll end up getting 6 from it, taking 3 damage, just playing another ring and then just not activating it, or only activating it when they possibly need like one more draw to end the game from there. So just 1 damage isn't going to matter, and they're going to get to draw 3 cards for 1 damage and possibly just replay another ring and stuff like that. Mill will actually like benefit from you drawing extra cards, on top of the fact that it has ways to fight against the things that shuffle into the graveyard or shuffle your graveyard in your library, like Endurance in the main deck. And I just wouldn't be surprised if one of these 3 decks were taken kind of with like that line of thinking, where they do powerful things, they're fairly consistent. Mill probably being the most inconsistent of the 3, but still being a very powerful choice, because it's very hard for your opponent to play spells when all their spells are in the graveyard. So those are kind of the decks that I'm expecting, aside from the usual like meta titans that we see like week in and week out, and like the modern challenges and the modern prelims. Finally, to kind of like wrap it all up kind of nicely, I hope and expect this Pro Tour, this modern one in particular, to be one of the most viewed Pro Tours. In particular, the fact that the modern metagame and modern in itself is very diverse with just decks that people play. There's probably at least like 7 or 8 decks that you could point to that have like a legitimate argument to kind of take the throne as like one of the best decks in the format, or at least an argument to be like one of the top 3 decks in the format, which not a lot of formats can say right now. And even going past that, there's multiple decks past like those top 8 of, best decks in the format that can hang and compete with those decks as well, having their goods and bad matchups as well. So I believe with the diversity of the PT and what we could see, from day 1, day 2, and even the top 8, because usually some oddballs end up making it into top 8 as well, just because they've, very good meta picks. I also believe with Modern being one of the most popular Eternal formats, and probably one of the most popular competitive formats, period, maybe outside of like EDH or something like that. I expect the Modern Pro Tour to hopefully be a mainstay on like the PT cycle, where we'll probably see like a standard, a modern, and like a pioneer, and like maybe another standard, just because that's kind of like what pushes all like the product and things like that. Is kind of what I would expect. But of course, if you have any thoughts or expectations of this upcoming Modern Pro Tour, I would love to hear and discuss them in the comment section, or of course in the Discord server as well, if that is something that you choose to do. That's going to wrap it up for this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Of course, comment down below what your expectations would be of this Modern Pro Tour, the first one that we've had, I believe, in a while, and in Paper 2, which is awesome. I absolutely love watching Paper Modern, even if it is on that godforsaken camera angle where it's straight down the middle instead of like from the side, like we're all conditioned to look at. Of course, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you know when videos like this and others get posted. That's going to do it for me. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.